For decades, Hezbollah has strangled Lebanon. This imperialist force has infiltrated every branch of government and dragged the country into multiple losing battles. It has besieged its neighbors in Israel and Syria, and it has silenced anyone who dares to speak out.
أنا بلعبتي مع الوحش صرت بآخر مرحلة ما قبل القتل.
Because no matter what they say, Hezbollah has never served the people of Lebanon. Their loyalties lie solely with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So how did an Iranian proxy come to dominate Lebanon? Hezbollah is headquartered in Lebanon. Its fighters are Lebanese. Its propaganda is in Arabic. But the story of Hezbollah doesn't begin in Lebanon, and its first chapter wasn't written in Arabic, but in Persian. Because the story of Hezbollah begins in Iran, with the firebrand Shia cleric named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. He believed that God had appointed him to usher in an Islamic revolution all over the world, starting in his native Iran. For years, his sermons fed Iranians' frustrations with their government. He'd always been upfront about his vision of Iran as an Islamic society governed by a strict form of Shia Islam. And yet, he was savvy enough to appeal to a wide audience, from the deeply religious to the left-wing intelligentsia. As anti-government protests reached a fever pitch in 1979, Iran's Shah fled, and Khomeini stepped in as Iran's supreme leader. Seemingly overnight, the secular Western imperial state of Iran vanished, replaced by an authoritarian theocracy known as the Islamic Republic of Iran. But the Ayatollah was just getting started. He planned to replicate his success in Iran all over the Muslim world, and he saw the perfect opportunity in a tiny country 1,000 miles away. Lebanon had once been known as the Switzerland of the Middle East, and its capital, Beirut, was a liberal cosmopolitan enclave that attracted tourists from all over the globe. It was the center of Lebanon's wealth, a financial capital for the Arab world. But by the time the Ayatollah took power, those days were long gone. Lebanon's festering sectarian tensions had erupted into civil war, and the chaos served the Ayatollah's interests perfectly. He exploited Lebanon's Shia Muslim minority, who had languished in poverty for decades, ignored by the powerful Christian bloc. So the Ayatollah invested heavily in neglected Shia neighborhoods, building up infrastructure and providing food, healthcare, and welfare programs. It was a canny strategy to buy the loyalty of Lebanon's most overlooked population. And it worked. So when the Iranian Revolutionary Guard offered to train and finance a Lebanese Shia militia, many jumped at the chance. Lebanon had splintered into heavily armed factions, and this new guerrilla force was just one more militia fighting for power. They called themselves Hezbollah, or Party of God. But their real master was the Ayatollah. Hezbollah was his answer to his twin obsessions, the USA and Israel. They did not let him down. By the 1980s, both countries had established a presence in Lebanon. Israel had rolled into Lebanon to fight against the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was based in southern Lebanon. Meanwhile, the US, along with the British, French, and Italians, had deployed a peacekeeping force to help the Lebanese government restore order. Hezbollah made a target of them both. They began by blowing up the IDF HQ, then the American embassy in Beirut, then the US Marine and French Army barracks. The casualties spiraled. But Hezbollah was just getting started, and they had no intention of stopping until they reached the goals outlined in their manifesto, whose first paragraph proudly trumpeted their allegiance to the Islamic Republic. We obey the orders of one leader, wise and just, that of our tutor and jurist who fulfills all the necessary conditions, Ruhollah Musawi Khomeini. God save him. Iran had positioned itself as an anti-imperialist, anti-Western force that would usher in a new age for Islam. Starting with Lebanon, the Islamic Republic would purge the Muslim world of corrupting forces, like Western modernity, Christianity, or Zionism, and replace them with a strict Islamist theocracy. Each of Hezbollah's goals served those interests. 1. To expel the Americans, the French, and their allies from Lebanon. 2. To prosecute a Christian political party whose paramilitary arm had racked up a serious rap sheet of atrocities against their fellow Lebanese. 3. To promote an Islamic Republic-style government in Lebanon. And 4. To destroy Israel. Or, as they put it, our struggle will end only when this entity is obliterated. Remember, Lebanon was the most modern, secular, and cosmopolitan country in the region. A third of its citizens were Christians. So Hezbollah's manifesto wasn't just an attack on outside Western forces or Western imperialism, but on the character of Lebanon itself. After 15 bloody, miserable years, Lebanon's surviving leaders signed a truce, which required every faction to lay down its arms with 2 exceptions. The Lebanese army got to keep its weapons because it was, after all, the official army of the Lebanese state. But Hezbollah also got to keep its weapons because they positioned themselves as a resistance group who would protect Lebanon against Israel. Yep, a guerrilla fighting force that was founded, funded, and loyal to another country somehow managed to position themselves as Lebanese patriots. But Hezbollah wasn't satisfied with its status as a guerrilla force. They turned their focus towards acquiring political power. Over the next few decades, they poured every resource at their disposal into wresting control of Lebanon's government. Over the past year, the Center for Peace Communications has interviewed Lebanese and Syrian citizens who are tired of Hezbollah ravaging their country. They know what happens to people who speak out, but they refuse to let Hezbollah silence them. Here is Rania describing Hezbollah's center of operations.
بيروت هي عاصمة لبنان، بس في كمان عاصمة ظل اسمها الضاحية عطرف بيروت. هونيكي بتتاخد القرارات الحقيقية من حزب الله. والضاحية مش بس مركز القوة بلبنان، هي كمان مركز الثقل لإمبراطورية كاملة. بالضاحية حزب الله عنده جهاز استخبارات ومكتب سياسي ومركز قيادة عسكرية. إذا مشيت بشوارعها تسمع الناس عم تحكي بلهجات عربية غير لهجتنا، عراقية، يمنية، سورية، فلسطينية. هودي ممثلين ميليشيات إيران بالمنطقة، عندهم مكاتب بالضاحية بتشبه السفارات، وبيرجعوا كلهم لغرفة عمليات مشتركة ليتلقوا تعليمات من حزب الله وينسقوا خططهم.
Because Hezbollah doesn't operate alone. It has colonized Lebanon at the behest of its mother country, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And everyone who has suffered under their rule knows it. Ali grew up in South Lebanon under Hezbollah's thumb, and he laments that they have changed his country for the worse.
امتى صار بلدي هيك؟ ما كان هيك. بس مش هو بلدي اللي ما بيشبهني، أنا بشبه بلدي، هن اللي ما بيشبهوا بلدي، هن المستوردين.
But how did a mere militia bring a country of 5 million people to its knees? The answer is a toxic cocktail of brainwashing, intimidation, and brute force.
هو الحزب الوحيد اللي معه سلاح بلبنان، باعتباره إنه ما بيستعملوا لهيدا السلاح إلا ضد عدو بهدف المقاومة. بس اللي منشوفه إنه هيدا السلاح بكل يوم مستعمل بأصغر الأشياء وأكبر.
That includes keeping the people of Lebanon in line for offenses like listening to music in public or hanging out with the opposite sex. So when Ali and his friends went on a hike in the woods, Hezbollah intervened.
فسألته إذا ضربني بعصاية. يجي شابين من وراه، واحد حمل عصاية، مش عصاية يعني هي جذع شجرة صغير، ببلش ضرب. ضله يضرب كأنه بروجرام على الضرب، ما يتطلع، ما يحكي، ما يسأل، ما يعمل شيء، بس يرجع ايده ويضرب.
Hezbollah's thugs beat Ali so hard that his bones separated from each other. Still, he found a way to fight back. When he finally left the hospital, he took the men who had beaten him to court. And then, the pressure began. Every day, different people would come to his house demanding he drop the charges. When that didn't work, Hezbollah offered bribes. When Ali refused, Hezbollah made the courts drop the case.
ساعة بيعطلوا، ساعة بيطلبوا إجراء جلسة، ساعة ما بيحضروا. مسيطرين على كل المؤسسات الدولة القضائية، الأمنية، البلدية.
Hezbollah didn't get there all on their own. Aside from the Islamic Republic, they had a powerful ally inside Lebanon. The Syrians had entered Lebanon during the Civil War. Nearly 3 decades later, they were still there, often working in lockstep with Hezbollah. The two had some important things in common. Both had a warm relationship with the Islamic Republic. Both hated Israel, and both claimed to be occupying Lebanon for its own good, though in reality, they were serving other interests. But the Lebanese were getting tired of Syria's interference. So when Lebanon's former prime minister kindly asked the Syrian president to stop meddling in his country's affairs, Hezbollah assassinated him along with 22 other people. And though Lebanon had seen its fair share of assassinations, this was a bridge too far for the Lebanese. The very next day, ordinary citizens rose up to take back their country. It worked. Bolstered by the support of Western countries, the Lebanese protesters drove out the Syrians without firing a single bullet. But this exhilarating taste of political power was all too brief, because the very next summer, Hezbollah dragged the Lebanese people into a devastating clash with the Israeli army. In July of 2006, Hezbollah operatives ambushed a group of Israeli soldiers, dragging 2 into captivity. Israel answered by flattening much of Beirut. Hezbollah's leader later said he wouldn't have picked a fight if he'd known how harshly Israel would respond. And yet, the group had no intention of leaving Israel alone, even at the cost of Lebanon's infrastructure and Lebanese lives. In 2009, they released an updated manifesto reiterating their policies towards the Jewish state. It was the same old boilerplate: categorical rejection, no recognition, we'll never change our opinion, etc., etc., etc. So predictable. But by 2011, Hezbollah had joined another fight. The Syrian Civil War was raging. Rebels fought government forces. The Syrian army responded by shelling civilians. It was a grim cycle. Hezbollah made it grimmer. For nearly a decade, they helped the Syrian government stamp out every whisper of rebellion through their systematic campaign of starvation, bombardment, and psychological warfare. Though Nasrallah had lots of highfalutin justifications for Hezbollah's actions in Syria.
إن وجود مقاتلين ومجاهدين على الأرض السورية هو بهدف الدفاع عن لبنان والدفاع عن فلسطين وعن القضية الفلسطينية وعن سوريا حضن المقاومة وسند المقاومة.
Much of the Arab world saw through these claims. Hezbollah had entered Syria because, yet again, its masters in the Islamic Republic smelled an opportunity. So even as they fought side by side with the Syrian army, Hezbollah was recruiting and training fighters to join new militias, obedient only to the Ayatollahs. With Hezbollah's help, the Syrian government had managed to cling to its power, a power that came at the cost of 500,000 Syrian lives. Many who survived found themselves living in hell. Alia was only 20 when her husband disappeared from their home in Raqqa. She feared he might have been abducted by Hezbollah and turned to a local Hezbollah operative for help.
فمشيت معه. رحنا كان المكان شوي بعيد عن المنطقة، كان مزرعة. خبرني إنه شغلت 10 دقائق يكون هون. مرت 10 دقائق بلش يتحرش فيني بالكلام باللمس وأنا أحاول أتحاشى بس ما قدرت عليه يعني. قال لي أنتي مو بدك إنه زوجك يطلع؟ خبرته إيه. تعرضت للاغتصاب. ضليت يومين عنده بالمزرعة على عنف وضرب وكلام واغتصاب وبلا أكل وبلا ما أعرف شيء ولا حدا يعرف عني شيء.
For the next 6 months, Alia was Hezbollah's slave, forced to service strange men day and night. She escaped only when her brother raised the $10,000 that Hezbollah demanded as her ransom. But thousands of women like Alia don't have the money to buy their way out of Hezbollah's international human trafficking ring. From Gambia to Syria to Kuwait, Hezbollah buys and sells vulnerable men, women, and children to finance their imperialist machine. And that's not their only source of revenue. They've also flooded the Arabian Gulf with homemade Captagon, a synthetic stimulant that induces euphoria. Not that they're too picky about what goes inside the product. Without oversight or regulation, Hezbollah's labs in Syria and Lebanon churn out contaminated amphetamines, generating roughly $10 billion of profit for the Assad regime every year, which is $1 billion more than Syria's official GDP. And as more and more people get sucked into the Captagon trade, whether as mules, distributors, or customers, the drug has ripped apart the social fabric of countries like Jordan and Saudi Arabia. But the mules ferrying the drug across the border are often forced into the job.
رحت عند عمي وقلت له إنه أنا ما عاد بدي أشتغل. انزعج وعصب علي وقال لي بوعدك ما رح تشوف الشمس بحياتك، رح أثر فيك إذا تركتنا. بعد بشي ساعة دق باب البيت وراح فتح بي الباب وفجأة سمعت أمي عم تصرخ. شفت الشباب اللي كانوا عم يشتغلون عند المعلم يضربوا والدي وهددوني إنه إذا ما رحت معهم رح قتل أبوي. ورحت معهم يعني. وقتها المعلم قال لي بدك كمان تطلع على الحدود.
But Hezbollah relies on a much more predictable source of income, the Islamic Republic. Even as the republic's economy buckles, the current Ayatollah manages to cough up an estimated $700 million for Hezbollah every year. Money they could use to rebuild Lebanon's crumbling infrastructure, or to ensure that the electricity stays on, or to pay down the country's massive debt. But Hezbollah is an arm of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Islamic Republic has no interest in the people of Lebanon. So Hezbollah has poured its billions into amassing an arsenal that outstrips the armies in carving an extensive network of tunnels 20 stories deep. They had planned to use those tunnels to invade Israel in a gruesome echo of Hamas's October 7th attack. But many Lebanese are sick of Hezbollah destroying their country, pouring much-needed resources into tunnels and weapons, rather than, well, anything useful. So in 2019, the people of Lebanon tried to rise up once more. Nonviolent protests and civil disobedience had managed to oust Syria from their borders. Now, they agitated against the government that had grown too weak and corrupt to protect them.
في كتير ناس محزبة ومش محزبة نزلت لتوصل صوتها وتوصل عدم رضاها عن هيدي الدولة المسؤولة. يعني الخي ضرب ابن عمه وخيه ورفيق ضرب رفيقه بس لأنه نحن عم نعبر عن رأينا وعم نقول نحن قبضنا هيدي هول السياسيين اللي حاكمين البلد.
فأنا عم صارع المجتمع واللي هو مغذى من كل هالأفكار الموروثة الذكورية العنصرية اللي بدك إياها سميها كيف ما كان يعني. بس أنا ضليت مصرة إنه حاربه. كنت مفكرة إنه حنقتل نحن الشيعة اللي ما بدهم هيدي المنظمة الإرهابية بالبلد.
But Hezbollah cracked down on the protests hard.
بيجي وفد من الشباب اللي حاملة عطسي وبيحاصروا مجموعة من الأشخاص ويبلشوا فيهم خبيط وضرب وقتل بالعالم وما فرقت معهم في أولاد صغار عالم كبير بالعمر كله أكل قتل. وهن كانوا عم يمرقوا بسياراتهم عاملين مثل مسيرة حاطين أعلام حزب الله كأنه عملوا انتصار يعني. فهون بلشت اللي مثلي بلشوا يسألوا أنه ليه عم تعملوا هيك؟ المقاومة هي بتحمي لبنان وجنوب لبنان من خطر بدق بلبنان. بس إذا نحن نزلنا لنعبر عن رأينا ونوصل صوتنا أنه نحن مش عايشين حاجاتنا الأساسية مش عم تتأمن فقديه واصلين لدرجة من غسيل الدماغ عند هول الشباب المنتميين لهم لحتى ينزلوا يضربوا جيرانهم وأهلهم حتى يسكتوهم.
These young men brought weapons with them to the protests. Protesters called the police demanding protection, but they never showed.
يعني تحسيها كأنه كان في اتفاق أو هالقد سلطتهم بمطرح بجنوب صارت عم تطلع فوق سلطة الدولة يعني هن اللي بياخذوا القرار تنزلوا أو ما تنزلوا. ما حدا توقف والناس اللي تهجم عليها وانقذت بمطرح ما أخذت حقها وحتى تغطى على الموضوع إعلاميا. قد ايه الناس بدها تضلها معطلة عن أعمالها وعن أشغالها لحتى تطالب بشيء وما حدا عم يسمعها. والشيء هذا كله بالنسبة للأثر النفسي اللي ترك عندنا.
No Western country stepped in to offer support. The Lebanese people were screaming, but the world turned its back. The global pandemic was the final straw. People stopped congregating. They stopped believing that anything would change. It took nearly 5 years, but things did change. On October 8th, 2023, Hezbollah opened another front against Israel. A day after the worst attack in Israel's history, Hezbollah began pounding Israel's northern border with rockets, forcing more than 60,000 Israelis to flee their homes. For months, the north of Israel was a ghost town. And though the Jewish state traded daily strikes with Hezbollah, neither side seemed willing to escalate. But then, Hezbollah made a mistake. Nearly a year into this awful new reality, a Hezbollah rocket hit a soccer field in the Druze town of Majd al-Shams. It was a balmy weekend evening, and the field was full of children at soccer practice. 12 of them never came home. And the Israelis finally said, enough. Within days, they assassinated the Hezbollah leader responsible for the attack, a man who had spent decades on the US's most wanted list for his role in the 1983 attack on the US Marines barracks. A month later, thousands of pagers exploded across Lebanon. Hezbollah uses low-tech devices like pagers specifically because they're impossible to hack. But in a years-long operation, Israeli intelligence had set up a shell company to sell Hezbollah the pagers, complete with wafer-thin explosives inside. In a matter of minutes, they wounded thousands of Hezbollah operatives, many of them seriously, sending the terror group into a tailspin. A day later, they repeated the trick, this time with Hezbollah's walkie-talkies. The group was in chaos. They were unable to communicate, wary of their own electronics, and increasingly paranoid. It was the perfect time to strike their high-level commanders. The commander-in-chief of Hezbollah's most elite fighting force, then the head of their missile corps, then the head of their drone unit, then the head of their central council, and then the head of their southern command. But the icing on the cake was the big guy himself. Hassan Nasrallah had eluded the Israelis for over 30 years. No matter how hard they pounded Lebanon back in 2006, he seemed forever out of reach, safe in his bunker in Dahya. Now, he was finally gone. Israel erupted in celebration, and so did parts of Syria and Lebanon. This is Idlib, Syria, a rebel stronghold frequently targeted by the Syrian government, Russia, and Hezbollah.
والله نحن انبسطنا كثير بهالخبر هذا اللي صار بحزب الله.
والله هن بيستاهلوا وكان خبر مفرح.
نحن ما بنشمت فيهم بس هالشيء هن مستاهلينه.
لأنه تشردنا، التشرد صار علينا والتهجير وحرق البيوت والكذا، وهجر العالم من بيوتها ومن ضيعها. يعني مع نظام المجرم بشار الأسد. لأنهم يعني شاركوا بقتل السوريين والسنة بشكل عام وظلموا كثير.
واليوم هن يعني عم يحتلوا أراضي سورية وعم يغتصبوها من أهلها اغتصاب يعني.
An anonymous Syrian even published a blog post in the Times of Israel reporting that so much baklava was shared that patisseries in Idlib were fully sold out for several days. Shortly after assassinating Nasrallah, Israel entered Lebanon, where the IDF has continued to strike Hezbollah's infrastructure, including the financial institutions that fund its operations. And from the sidelines, Lebanese media star Mariam Laham is cheering the Israelis on.
لا أحد يتقبل هذه الحرب ولا أحد متضامن مع حزب الله، حتى الأشخاص اللي أنت شايفهم أنهم عم يفتحوا بيوتهم للعالم أو عم يعطوا دم هن منهم متقبلين حزب الله ولا حاضنين حزب الله ولا مع حزب الله ولا يراهنوا على لبنان لحزب الله.
She recognizes clearly what many in the West seem so intent on denying. Hezbollah is not a resistance group. It is an occupying force that has brought nothing but misery to every country it touches. Any misguided person who cheerleads them as a resistance movement is in fact celebrating the grasping arm of an Islamist empire determined to replace the indigenous cultures of the Levant. They're championing an Islamist dictatorship where women can be carted off to prison for showing their hair, and journalists disappear into dank cells for years before they're publicly hanged. I don't want to deny that Israel's strikes on Hezbollah have been hard on Lebanon. Yet, many Lebanese accept that they share a common enemy with the Jewish state. And in taking down Hezbollah's commanders, arsenals, and banks, Israel is also opening up an opportunity for brave people to speak out and take their country back at last.
المسألة صارت إما تعيشين هاربة من اللا عدالة أو تموتين على مذبح علي خامنئي. ما فينا يعني نواجه هيك نهج إذا الأكثرية اليوم عم بتفضل تسكت حاليا والاكتفاء بمشاهد اللي عم بتصير أو مشاهدة اللي عم بتصير. أجمل انتصار صار نصر حزب الله بالسيف على العدو يلي فشل يترجم نصر بالدماء علينا نحن المعارضين.
Lebanon's last revolution failed, crushed by Hezbollah, weakened by the world's apathy. But there is a chance for this beautiful, tiny country to regain its former status as the Switzerland of the Middle East. And history will judge us all if we don't reach out and take this opportunity.